Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the special business meeting and budget workshop of the Board of Education, Tuesday, May 31st, 2022. Please rise for the pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Before we start the budget presentation, so at this point, I need a motion to move dockets 1-393 to 1-396.
So move.
Any questions? Fred has no questions. All in favor? Aye. Motion's passed. So that was the docket portion of our evening. I'm gonna let sit down and then gonna let Mr. Press discuss the budget. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight to listen to Mr. Press's presentation in regard to a few changes in the budget. The statewide revote date is June 21st. So we will be revoting on the budget on June 21st from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. in the middle school gym as we had back in May. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Mr. Press to give us a presentation.
Evening. Okay. All right. We are here to discuss budgets again. In this case, the budget revote on June 21st. I'm here to present to you what I believe is again, a fiscally responsible budget, continuing the practice that we have done for a number of years. So without further ado, I wanted to start off and talk about fund balance. There was, I believe there was a lot of communication going on in the community. There was a flyer that was handed out. I know at the budget vote, a few people came up to me to ask me about the district's fund balance. Fund balance is a little complicated. I felt really we should kind of take the time to explain it to you so that ourselves and the community can better understand what our fund balance is, what it can and can't be. So fund balance is essentially the funds that are held by the district. Typically, they are liquid funds, cash, things like that. There are 5 categories of fund balance. The 5 categories are dictated to us by our friends at the Governmental Accountability Standard, Governmental Accounting Standards, or GASB, which is our budget. So the 5 categories are up on the slide. Non-spendable, really not anything that we have to discuss this evening. We're going to talk about general fund balance this evening. We don't have non-spendable. Non-spendable is typically things like inventory. We do have non-spendable fund balance in things like the cafeteria fund. At the end of the year, we have food left over. We assign a value to that food. That is our non-spendable fund balance in the cafeteria fund. The next category is restricted fund balance. That's typically our restricted reserves. That is where the bulk of our fund balance is held. Restricted fund balance is fund balance that is restricted for a specific purpose as designated by law. Get into that a little bit more. Committed fund balance, we really don't have much of that. So I'm going to get into that. Assigned fund balance, it's fund balance that doesn't fall into any of these previous categories, but it is fund balance that is intended for a specific use. And there's the 2 kinds that we listed up there: assigned, appropriated, and unappropriated. So we'll talk about that more as we go through. And the final category is the unassigned fund balance. And that's the rest of the fund balance that we have that does not fall into any of the previous categories. So there's your 5 categories of fund balance. I apologize, it's very, very, very dry topic. Please, I try my best not to put to sleep. I'm keeping an eye on this Brian. like keep her awake. I wanted to share these next two slides, this information directly from the comptroller's office. Typically, I don't like to read slides, but I think there's really salient points in these two slides that's important to know. So I'm going to read through these. Saving for future projects, and this has to do with reserve funds. Saving for future projects, acquisitions, and other allowable purposes is an important planning consideration for local governments and school districts. Reserve funds provide a mechanism for legally saving money to finance all or part of future infrastructure, equipment, and other requirements. Reserve funds can also provide a degree of financial stability by reducing reliance on indebtedness to finance capital projects and acquisitions. In uncertain economic times, reserve funds can also provide officials with a welcome budgetary option that can help mitigate the need to cut services or to raise taxes. In good times, money not needed for current purposes can often be set aside for reserves for future use. This is coming from the New York State Comptroller's Guide, the local government guide on fund balance. In terms of the unassigned fund balance, in addition to reserve funds, maintaining a reasonable amount of undesignated fund balance within operating funds is another important financial consideration for local governments and school districts. A reasonable level of unreserved, unappropriated fund balance provides a cushion for unforeseen expenditures or revenue shortfalls. It helps to ensure that adequate cash flow is available to meet the costs of operations. Combining a reasonable level of undesignated fund balance with specific legally established reserve funds provides resources for both unanticipated events and other identified or planned needs. Again, that's from the Comptroller's office. I think it's important for us to keep that in mind as we go through the conversation. So the reserve funds, as I mentioned, creating reserve funds is governed by state law. We can only create reserve funds that the law allows us to create. We cannot create reserve funds for any particular purpose that we may want to create them. And the use of funds that are held in these reserve funds is guided by the law that established the reserve fund. So it's restricted. The use of that money is restricted for the use for which that reserve was created. And we'll go through that a little bit more. So hopefully that'll be a little clearer. We have 4 reserve funds: unemployment, the Employee Benefit Accrued Liability Reserve, commonly known as EBLR, and then our 2 Retirement System Reserve, the Employee Retirement System Reserve and the Teachers Retirement Reserve. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So the Unemployment Reserve, very straightforward. It's to cover unemployment expenses that the district incurs. That's it. Currently, our balance in that reserve as of 6/30/21, that's the date of last measurement, is about $550,000. Our budgeted expense for 22-23 is $75,000. We have not budgeted the use of any funds from this reserve. And if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to stop me if I'm not clear or if you want. The EBLR reserve, this is generally used to pay retirement payouts. Typically for us, that's unused sick days. For those people who qualify to be paid out for their sick days when they retire. Currently, again, as of 6/30/21, our balance there is just under $3 million. We budgeted expenses of $305,000 and use of funds from the reserve of $275,000. Our ERS reserve, our Employee Retirement System Reserve, and this is to cover mandated contributions from the school district for the retirement funds for employees that are not part of the teachers' retirement system. Our budget there is just about $8.1 million. Our budgeted expenses in the budget for 22-23 about $875,000, and we are budgeting to use $875,000 from the reserve to fund those expenses. And finally, the Teachers' Retirement System Reserve. This was one of the more recently.
Mr. Brett, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interject. The previous slide, can I just ask a question on that one?
See, Mrs. Day at the end of the presentation.
Oh, okay, because he said.
Yeah, no,
I
he's
wasn't-
talking to us.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
No,
that's okay.
The TRS Reserve was created a couple of years ago. That's when actually the law passed that allowed school districts to create a reserve for the teachers' retirement fund system. So we have about $600,000 in there. Our expense is about $2.5 million a year. That's what we budgeted for next year. And our use of that reserve is $250,000. So that's our 4 reserves.
How do you determine the right amount to keep in reserve of each one?
It's generally, what we look at, so in the case of the teacher's retirement reserve, obviously, we don't have enough in there to cover our annual expenses. The new reserve, we are building up, or trying to build up the reserve to help cover the expense. For the other reserves, we generally look at the expense per year over a period of time. So typically, if you have, upwards of, 10 years worth of your expense in the reserve, that's generally considered. That's what we're looking. We work with our auditors to determine what we feel and what they feel is an appropriate amount.
And these numbers can only be used for what they're assigned.
Right. So we can only use monies from, in this example, the teacher's retirement system reserve to cover teacher's retirement system expenses. We can't, go back to like our ERS reserve, we have $8 million. We can't just say, well, I have expenses for busing. I want to use the money because I have $8 million in ERS reserve. Why can't I use that to cover busing? Can't. The law doesn't allow us to do that. So if we have $875,000 in budgeted expenses, the most we can use from the ERS reserve for next year is $875,000. All right, so those are the 4 reserves. Now I want to talk about, again, part of fund balance. This is the assigned part of the fund balance. We talked about assigned fund balance categories. Assigned fund balance that is not restricted, but it is intended to be used for a specific purpose. In this case, the specific purpose is that we have used approximately $2.5 million of fund balance we have appropriated it for use in the budget as a source of revenue for the 22-23 budget. So that is our assigned fund balance. We have assigned unappropriated fund balance. I'm going to try my best to explain this one. These are funds that are held to cover purchase orders that are still open at the end of our fiscal year on June 30th. So just a little bit of background on the purchasing. School districts can only purchase things through the use of purchase orders. Sometimes what happens is we order things, they don't come in by June 30th. The accounting rules dictate that we carry forward those purchase orders into the next year. We carry forward the revenue to pay for those purchase orders into the next year. That's what this $135,000 is. So this is assigned, again, the assigned fund balance is intended for a specific purpose. The specific purpose here is to cover the purchase orders that are carried over. Does that make sense?
So those are open purchase orders that we have not received the material for yet.
Correct. And this is at the end of June 30th. So at this point in the year, that those are all been paid out. Because this is last year's carry over to this year. Our unassigned, unappropriated fund balance, right? The unassigned fund balance is the fund balance that we hold that doesn't fall into any of those previous categories. New York State real property law, again, this is governed by law, says that school districts can hold up to 4% of the following year's budget in the unappropriated, unassigned fund balance. So our balance in that account is $3 million. We are a little bit above the 4%. What happened at the end of last year or during last year is we identified as part of the bond project, there was a structural wall problem that was uncovered during the construction. So the repair costs on that are actually way higher than I can't even imagine. So we held funds to potentially cover those expenses. We spoke with the auditors. They said it's an allowable practice. The board adopted a resolution last year to hold an additional sum of money to try to help cover those expenses. So we're a little bit above the 4%. But this is the unassigned fund balance. The unassigned fund balance, this is the fund balance that is held, that is unrestricted. This is this is the rainy day fund. In total, we have $17.8 million in fund balance, but again, we'll go through, most of that is restricted. This is the only bit of money. It's not.
Right, so the extra money, if they want to call it, the little bit that we saved, that we adopted the docket last year to save that money, will be spent on the repair. It just has not been paid out yet.
Right, that work hasn't
That's
been.
the reason that we're over 4%.
Well, and again, these are numbers as of 6:30, but that work has not been.
And Joel, I'm sorry, just to be clear, so no one questions, what does a little bit mean? do you have a number, an approximate dollar amount, what that little bit consists of?
The dollar amount is $250,000. Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
estimates we got for that expense were very high.
Was this the fund we used for the year we went out with the $0 tax increase, 0% tax increase during COVID? This was the fund we used for that?
We held additional fund balance over and above the 4% going into 2021 because of COVID, the unknown COVID, and because the governor had threatened to withhold 20% of our state.
So this is the type of fund used for that. If something happens to one of the buildings, it's not expected a repair. This is the fund that would pay for that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be money for it, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, generally, this is to cover the unexpected expenses that may come up during the year. If expenses come in way above normal, medical costs just gone through. It's intended to cover the unexpected.
So if we use, say, if the government promised us X amount of dollars, we only got a little bit less, we would use this to pay for whatever they didn't send us.
That's a good point. I know I wasn't around for this, but I know years ago, maybe some of you may remember, the government in the middle of the year said, yeah, we're not paying you what you state aid. And so, you either in the middle of cut things or you cut staff, or you can, if there's in that fund balance, you could use that to help kind of cushion the blow.
So in addition, Joel, the monies in this account is where we would get the money to and/or fund the money to replace the turf on the field, or when the auditorium ceiling fell down.
If something happened during the year that created an emergency situation, we could use that fund balance. Repairing the field sort of longer term, that's a different conversation. We have to budget for this. That's going to be a large expense. So we'd have to budget for that, or we have to sort of talk about establishing either a repair reserve or a capital reserve to put funds in there to accumulate funds enough to cover
For that
that field replacement cost. I mean, who knows what they're going to be in 8 or 10 years when that field needs to be replaced. Could be, $1 million. That's generally not that you can just budget for in the regular budget.
But you can't start a capital reserve similar to these. How does that work?
So capital reserves would need to be voted on by the public to create the capital reserve. And then those capital reserves could be funded by revenue that's available at the end of the year. We would then need to have to go out to the public again. We couldn't spend money out of that reserve unless the public voted in favor of spending the money from that reserve.
It's a two-step process.
It's
First to establish
right.
an actual reserve, and
Correct.
wall has to get fixed. We have this much money.
Yes.
But that can be done at any time during the year. It doesn't have to be done just at the budget vote, correct?
Well,
Like the capital reserve, let's say we chose to establish a capital reserve, we put that up, say at the same time as the budget vote or whatever. But if the middle of the year came and it was the downtime, we had no playing going on and we wanted to fix the turf field, with that money, we could vote on that in the middle of the year. It didn't have to be at the same time.
right, you could go out, in fall and say we want to spend money in capital reserve, ask the community to vote in favor of that. Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah, there are a lot of, I wasn't here, but I know with the first bond that was put up, there was some repair work in some buildings that was pulled out when the second bond was awarded. And so there's still things that need to be repaired there. There's other things that will come up. Our buildings are old. We did a lot of work, the bond work, but that didn't touch every area of our buildings. So there's some aging buildings that could use.
And our 4% for this unappropriated fund balance, how does that compare to other districts on Long Island? With what percentage they keep their fund balance at?
Most districts keep at the 4%. Some keep a little bit more. A lot of districts hold stuff, funds in their capital reserve, things like that. But most districts will stay at the 4%.
So once again, in order to create the capital reserve, we have to get the public's approval.
Yes.
Money for just It's hard for us to hear you.
Oh,
No.
I
okay.
think it's your turn.
Are we loud enough up here?
You guys
Yes.
are.
All right. I'm trying to use my teacher voice.
Oh, maybe it's Tina's mic. Sorry. Joel, not to cut you off, I'm sorry. Just for those of you in the virtual audience, I do see a couple of hands raised. There will be a question period at the end, so you could just leave your hand up and I'll call you, at that point.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good, all right.
Start from the beginning, please.
All right, Blame me on. All right. And again, I'm not going to read through this again. These are the same slides that were up earlier. But again, take a look at these. Again, the unassigned, undesignated fund balance is something that the comptroller, New York State comptroller, has basically said it's a good thing for fiscal responsibility. And similarly with reserve funds, they provide a sense of financial stability. I will also point out that our level of reserve funds has served us well. When we do the borrowing for these bond projects, we get cited for having healthy reserves that allows us to get a better rate of return on the market. We have a very high rating. We just got a rating last week on our bond anticipation note. That was the highest rating that Moody's assigns to governmental institutions for short-term debt. So it does help us out so that our interest expenses are generally lower. So our total general fund balance, this is the $17.8 million. We're going to just kind of go through it a little bit. $12.25 million in there is held in restricted reserves. Again, the use of these funds is restricted for the purpose that the reserve was established for. We cannot go in and say we've got $12 million. Let's just use all of that to fund the budget. We can only use that to the extent we have expenses that fit into those categories. Our restricted reserves make up about 70% of our fund balance, general fund balance. Unappropriated fund balance, again, this is the $135,000 to cover the purchase orders. That is restricted. Appropriated fund balance, these are funds in the fund balance that we have used as a source of revenue to cover the expenses in our proposed budget. So all in total, 83% of our fund balance is restricted in some way. The only thing that's unrestricted is the $3 million that we talked about, the unassigned fund balance. That's what's generally there, the 4%. So that's our total $17.8 million. It's not that we have $17.8 million that we're not using, or that we can just use as we see fit. Any questions about any of that?
No questions, but I'm glad that this is spelled out because I think this will clear up a lot of questions, that this is not just money just as to be spent frivolously. Can't be spent, period. 83% is restricted. So thank you for laying that out for
Sure.
the public.
Yeah, that was my intent. So I hope that does come across. All right. So in terms of our budgeted use of reserves and fund balance, we have increased the budgeted use of reserves and fund balance over the last few years. You can see in 1920, our budgeted use of reserves was about $385,000. We have increased that to going into 22-23, about $1.4 million that we've appropriated. In terms of appropriated fund balance, we've also increased that use from $915,000 up to now $2.4 million. So our total use of reserves and fund balance in the budget has increased over the last few years. The one caveat here is that increased use of reserves and fund balance is like pulling money out of your savings account. If you either don't replenish it or at some point stop taking funds out, the money goes away. And you lose that source of revenue to fund your budget. So that's why we budget conservatively, so that we can allow this, our reserves and our fund balance to be there for us to fund the budget.
I just want to interject there for 1 second, because if anybody, I don't know if all of you were here back in 2010 or not, but for those of us that were here in 2010, we lived that part of our savings account being depleted when the prior administration and the prior board made the choice for a few years to spend down all the fund balance and all of our reserves. It was a wonderful opportunity to help the community, and that was great. But then the following year, we went out with a 9.24% budget that failed because there was no money to help. So we had to put it out to the community. I was not sitting on the board at the time, I was PTA, but it was a hard fight, and that budget went down terribly. And then they went out with a 4.12 or something. I don't remember the number, 4.91% budget at that point. And, you know, that's a hard pill to swallow if you have to go back out to replenish all those reserves. So spending wisely and utilizing that money wisely, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, we'll spend it down, we'll spend it down, we'll spend it down to almost nothing, is not always the smartest thing.
I would agree. Well said. In terms of so we talked about the budgeted use. In terms of the actual use of reserves over time, the actual use has also increased over the years. And these numbers are available in our financial statements. So you can see we've gone from about $250,000 use of reserves to $1.2 million. So we are using the reserves. We are budgeting for the use of the reserves. The reserves are not just sitting there, they're reserves and fund balance. All right, in terms of our proposed budget, the original proposed budget was about $71.4 million. That was the budget that was proposed in May. Our revised proposed budget, $71.2 million. It's a reduction of about $190,000. It's a $2.3 million budget to budget increase, which is 3.26, down from the original budget was 3.61% budget to budget increase. In terms of our proposed tax levy, again, the original proposed tax levy in May was 2.14%. We are now proposing for your consideration a tax levy increase of 1.64%, so that's a 0.5% decrease in the tax levy. And that is within the district's tax cap for the 11th year in a row, for the entire duration of the tax cap. I do want to point out, you know, again, the board went out with a 0% tax levy in the 2021 school year. So over the course of the 3 years leading into next year, the average increase in the tax levy is 1.25%. In terms of how we came to this revised budget number, some of the things that we looked at was the use of funds from our debt service fund. These are funds that can only be used to cover debt service being the payments, the annual payments that we make for the serial bonds that we've taken out to cover the bond projects, energy performance contracts and things like that. The realignment of the middle and high school administration has allowed us to save some funds. This is in connection with the restructuring of the secondary plan. There were some retirements that came to us after the previous budget had been developed that we were able to now go back and look at and adjust the budget there based on those people we had budgeted for them to return next year. They're not returning, so we budget for a replacement at a lower salary than the retiree. We also had some individuals who either resigned or retired and were retired mid-year and were replaced. At the point that they resigned and or retired, we didn't have replacements, so we budgeted for their replacements. The actual people that we hired, because we didn't hire for those positions, were hired at a lower salary. So we recognize some savings there. And we are negotiating our contract with our teachers. I cannot speak in great detail about that. What I just can say is that, you know, again, when we developed the budget, we were at a certain point in the negotiations. As we have moved along, we were able to recognize some savings as a result of those negotiations. So I will leave that one there. So we saved some funds. We were able to reduce the budget for that. Additionally, again, when we developed the budget, not everyone has their actual costs for us going into the next year. Our insurers are in that boat as well. Our general liability insurer, our workers' compensation insurer gave us estimates. When we developed the May budget, they came back to us with actuals, so we were able to now build those, and those actuals came in below estimate, so we were able to lower the budget accordingly. And then there's some software products that we, in one case we were using, we decided not to use that software product anymore. We didn't need that. In another case, we were looking to implement some new software to assist with our onboarding and offboarding process and document management flow. We were looking at one solution and we had budgeted for that solution. It was a higher cost solution. We ended up going with a lower cost software solution. So we were able to adjust the budget down because of that as well. And that's where we were able to arrive at our revised budget. Any questions about any of that?
No real question, but you said you replaced some of the administrative software. Is that going to impact any of the efficiency of that software?
No.
We'll do it different.
No.
Yeah, and the software we were looking at was very, very robust, probably more robust than we needed. It's very, it's a great program. It's a very costly program, and we feel we can get the same out of this other software. And the software that we're going to go with actually ties more. It's from the same software provider that provides some of our other software options, so the communication would be better as well.
That'd be a good time to ask about possible other options that were considered or would be possible in terms of the other lower, other options of how much, if it was going to be lower, what that would mean? Or is there something you want to talk about later that would be a more appropriate time?
No, being lower in terms of what we're proposing?
Yes. So like round numbers, 1% as opposed to 164. What would that?
If we're looking at 1%, we're looking probably at the, we have some retirees in positions that we are planning to fill those positions. We just may not be able to fill those positions.
And then what happens? Meaning there's a spot that was there, there's no longer. What does that mean? Larger class sizes or what is the?
It's the potential for larger class sizes. And I'll talk about that when we talk about what happens if the budget doesn't pass. But could be larger class sizes, could be reduction in some clubs and extracurriculars, possibly some elective courses that we may not be able to run because we don't have enough staffing to be able to run all of them, things like that.
So that's opportunities for our students to be engaged, whether it's a club or whether it's an elective.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
Thank you.
All right, so just, this is a recurring slide. The challenges that we faced in putting the budget together in May, and again, here, these challenges don't go away with the revote. Our retirement system mandated contributions have gone up about $285,000. Medical insurance premiums have just skyrocketed. This year, we're budgeting for a fairly large increase, almost $700,000. And then transportation, which, as you can see here, has just been a huge cost driver for the district for the last 3 years. Transportation costs have gone up about 75% in 4 years leading into next year, and they have nearly doubled in about 8 years.
Transportation doubled, you said, in a year?
Not in a year. It's nearly doubled over 8 years. Yeah. So if the budget does not pass June 21st, by law, we have to adopt a contingency budget. What that means is a 0% increase in the tax levy. And a 0% increase in the tax levy means a reduction from our current levy of $950,000. So we would have to consider a budget that was reduced by $950,000, which is a significant reduction. By law, all non-contingent budget items have to be removed from the budget. We can discuss that when we get there. Included in that is all equipment that is not essential for the instructional program. In the event of a contingency budget, this is following up on Mr. Hoffman's question earlier, some of the things that we would need to consider, increasing class sizes that would be due to staff reductions, eliminating of athletics clubs and extracurriculars, reducing the elective course offerings, as I mentioned, eliminating the use of district facilities by outside groups. And we'd have to look at transportation very, very closely, including combining bus routes and possibly considering centralized pickups largely for out-of-district transportation.
So 2 questions on that. First, can you speak to a little more about what centralized pickup means?
So centralized pickup is where, depending on how it's established, it could be that parents would drive their children to a specific location. It could be a single location, depending on the number of students that may be traveling on that route. The parents would bring their children to a single location. The bus would pick them up and go to the school from that centralized pickup spot, instead of going to corner stops, throughout the neighborhoods.
Right. And is it also drop off or just
Drop off as well.
So in other words, parents would have to go get their kids, and if their kids go to multiple schools, they'd have to go to multiple locations possibly, drop off their kids, and then pick them up at a day, which is probably earlier than their parents' work day, to go get them again.
It's a possibility, yeah. And the pickups and the drop-offs would be whenever the students got out of school or whenever they started school in the morning. The bus would pick them up at an appropriate time to get them to school on time, and then at the end of the day, bring them back. But someone would need to be responsible for picking the child up, bringing them home.
Sure. And can you talk a little bit about why it's only out of district or primary out of district? Because we got a healthy side of land here in West Hempstead. In theory, it might be in district as well. Can you explain why it would just be out of district?
It's largely would be out of district because of the number of routes that we have and the distance. Having a centralized pickup for in-district transportation, we could certainly consider that. But the routes are so short as it is, to have people are entitled to their transportation based on the mileage. Right? The mileage limits don't change because we go to contingency budget. So having people in district, because we're a very, very small district in district. So having centralized pickup for in district may not really make sense, may not really allow us to recognize a lot of savings. The savings may come for a lot of our out of district transportation, particularly at the schools at a distance, particularly in more congested areas where it just takes longer to get there. Right now, what we provide in some cases is small vans, particularly for schools in Queens, because the roads, are restricted. The large buses, can't go on the Southern State Parkway, but the small vans can. So in some cases, we may send 4 vans to one school. In that case, where we could fit those kids on 2 large buses, a centralized pickup may save us a considerable amount of money.
Yeah. Like a kindergartner on the bus for an hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe.
It's entirely possible. We try with our current plans to avoid those lengthy trips.
Yeah. How many schools do we go to again?
It's about 120 schools out of district. That includes, our not just our private schools and the parochial. It also includes special ed schools and BOCEs and things like that as well.
And if we're increasing this, it would mean increasing class size district wide. I mean, this is more of just a reading question, but it's like generally we see larger class sizes lead to poorer performance generally. Obviously, generally there. So if people are concerned about performance, if anything, this will hurt that rather than help, right? Am I understanding generally?
There's plenty of research that shows that.
Do we have an average class size now? I mean, unfortunately, we can't say about every program, because some of the programs are specialty programs where only, a handful of kids are taking those programs.
Secondary level.
At the second, I would say even at the secondary level.
Give me a few minutes. Come back.
Sure, I'll come back.
And I guess that goes to that same kind of question, which we have, I always forget the name of them, those small group classes that we have for some special needs classes.
Right.
Like those have to increase too? Like the whole point of those is
No,
or those are,
That's by law.
that's by law, okay.
Law.
That's what I was
8
wondering.
months, 12 months, 15 months.
That's what,
You can get a variance for 1 student.
Right.
Maybe 2, but that's not.
That's
likely,
not right.
like 1.
okay, so it won't affect that.
No, what would happen, if it's an 8-1 class, but you have 12 kids, you have to have really 2 classes of 6. So. Different.
Sure. Thank you. And Cornwall and GW, Dan, on both of all of those classrooms are basically used.
Elementary schools they're, I don't want to, they're tight. They're tight. We use the word tight.
But we have no like empty classrooms.
GW Cornwall?
Yeah.
No, the city always is calling me. Built an annex or something.
Gonna put an RV.
We've actually, we made our office smaller this past summer, our facility, we did a summer to build a small office for social
Um, just further on this topic, if the budget fails again, the savings to the average single-family homeowner in West Hempstead of that reduction of $950,000, it's approximately $153 for the year.
For the year.
For the year,
Per household is
Per-
$153
yes,
for the year.
for the
That's
year.
if we go contingency.
Thank you very much.
That's, yes.
It's 2 pairs of shoes.
It's about 42 cents a day.
That's up to
Or some, very bad coffee, as Mr. is fond of saying.
That cup of coffee every day.
Yeah, to put this a little sort of side by side, $153 for the year versus, the potential reductions on the right side of the screen.
Sorry, I should have asked earlier. When we say no youth, it's 2 different words, so I want to make sure. One said by outside groups means any, even in-district groups that would want to use the facilities. And why is that?
That's the law says we cannot allow outside use unless they pay for all of the.
Okay, so anybody who we grant the free permits to would have to pay to be able to use them. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't.
Right. Well, and then again, if they wanted to pay in advance for the use, when especially depending on the schools, we have our ground staff stays late for things like athletics. On the weekends, we open up. Specifically, we don't have people staffed on the weekends when we open up on the weekends for use. There's a cost associated with that, especially on the weekends. It's overtime. So those costs would have to be covered in full by the outside groups.
So when you're talking about nonprofit groups such as the Little Leagues and the soccer club and
Everything,
stuff like that.
all
as well.
outside use.
Really amounts to more of a cost for many residents.
Right. Because then they have to charge them more money,
Right.
correct?
At the point, again, if the budget does fail, the district would present a contingency budget for consideration by the Board of Education.
Well, if it automatically goes to 0, because it's how it's allocated.
It's right, we say it goes to 0, but we determine how we want to,
Put the 0.
right, how we want to implement that 0. Yep.
Okay.
And so that's the end of the conversation there. Again, these timelines here, these are dictated by law. So we have a budget adoption's got to happen by June 7th at the latest. That's next Tuesday. We are scheduled to meet here again. June 14th is the budget hearing, again, required by law. Just want to also note there will be a regular Board of Ed business meeting that night as well. The Board of Ed meeting that was originally scheduled for the 21st has been rescheduled for the 14th. And then the budget revote, Tuesday, June 21st, middle school gym, same that time, same that channel, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. And at that, I will open it up to questions.
Okay,
Any more
so
questions?
I'm going to give Mr. Reman another minute or so to answer to my question. So I'm going to go, I'm going to let the board wait a little bit. Mrs. Day, you had the first question, so if you want to ask your question.
I have a couple of questions. Well, the first thing I just wanted to ask if you could just give us a little bit of clarity if there is a distinction when we speak about the reserve funds. And we also talk about future projects, because I know that we had the bond and some money got allotted to that from previous budgets. Is that bond money not included in the reserve funds? Is that the separate capital funds that you were referring to?
It's not the capital funds. I was referring to the debt service fund. Bond project money is completely separate from this budget. We can't use the bond fund money for any of the general operating expenses of the district.
Okay, so that's a whole separate
So
fact.
let me just answer to one thing that you said. So you asked a question about the bond money that we voted on a couple of years ago is only to be used for the projects that were within that bond. So that
Okay.
has nothing to do with any of
So the
this stuff.
reserve funds is other future projects.
That's not necessarily future projects. It's the general fund money is like your car dies and you have to go buy a new car, or the wall breaks and we find a structural issue in the wall. It's your savings account for if your oil burner breaks in the house, right?
You kind of like project that in the future. Yeah, I understand that, yeah.
In
But
terms of
because
the,
it said future projects, I was trying to just create the distinction between
Gotcha.
the two, the reserve funds for future projects. It would not, the capital bond project was totally separate from the.
that's correct. And so, and I know I did mention, reserve funds for future projects.
Correct.
Capital reserve is a reserve fund that we would hold funds for projects more along those lines. The reserves that we have now are just to cover generally expenses, operating expenses. That capital reserve would be a reserve that would be used to cover capital projects.
Okay, and another question is we mentioned something about a project that was expected to be done, but it was, we anticipated that it would get done, but it didn't get done, and that's why we're a little bit over the 4%. How do we handle those situations, where we project for something to get done a previous year and then it doesn't happen, and then do we allot more money towards that particular project, or do we just keep that aside and then not go up on the budget in that area?
We could, so we held the additional funds that I mentioned in unappropriated fund balance for this year. If we were to hold those funds forward into next year, for that purpose, we would need to adopt a resolution again to hold those funds in the unassigned fund balance.
So does that amount come up with what we want to appropriate for the following year budget too combined, or is there a separate line item? So say if we said all right, you know what, we had I think you said around 250K for a project that didn't get done. And you're recalculating the budget for the following fiscal year. And you're all right, you know what, we're gonna do we wanna have a budget of $1 million for this particular area. Do you include that 250K with the million, or do you have a separate line item area for that amount? Or is it just excluded from the budget because it's already reserved? Trying to get a real live view of the appropriation of how that money is added in or taken out.
So the money that we held coming into this year, the 250,000, was there was a board resolution to hold those funds for that purpose. We would do the same if that was the intent, to carry those funds forward into the next year.
Okay. But would it come up all right, I'm not sure specifically, I think you said a wall or something like that. I don't know if he's understanding my question.
Right, so let me see if I can explain if I'm understanding what you're asking.
Okay.
So what happened was, at the end of last year, we're at 4% or 3.9%, whatever. There was a little bit of extra money from last year that instead of putting it into one of these restricted reserves, we ended up finding out that there is a structural issue in a wall at Chestnut Street.
Okay.
In at the end of the new pre-K spot. So we need to fix that wall so that the kids can go into the classroom.
Okay.
So after speaking with the auditors said we could go above, we could take that money, instead of putting it into a restricted reserve that we couldn't touch, we could do a resolution to save that money over the 4% to be spent this year on fixing the damage to the wall. It's not budget money, it's like leftovers. It's like what you have left at the end of your paycheck after 2 weeks when you went out shopping for shoes
No,
apparently.
I know.
So
Yeah. So
you
it would
put it-
come up in the reserves with
Right.
the amount that,
the
total
amount is already there. If
Okay.
the wall doesn't get completed before June 30th this year, we then have to do another resolution to keep that money there in order to still pay for the wall when it's finished.
okay, so it comes up in the total amount
Yeah.
allocated to that particular area.
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's what I was asking. My second question is, for the ERS, I don't know if you want to go back to the slide, you probably know it from front to back, so there's probably no need for you to go back to the slide, but, the budgeted amount said 8 million, and, the annual expenditure for the payoffs for that particular reserve fund was 875K. So I just kind of feel like that's very high because it's 11% of what's being budgeted on an annual basis. So I think Gabi kind of asked a little bit, who determines what's an appropriate amount for that particular area? I really want to know a little bit, prying a little bit into like, how often do the auditors reevaluate, where they obtain these metrics from? And how much is considered like acceptable? Because 11% of what's being given, I believe the ERS goes to retirement of teachers, right?
Yes.
So 11%,
Not teachers,
annually.
not teachers, employees.
Employees.
Employees that are not, non-teaching employees.
Non-teaching employees, okay, but staff,
Yes.
okay. So 875K is being utilized on an annual basis, which is 11% of the 8 million, which is being annually budgeted for in our budget, which seems like a pretty steep number. So I'm just trying to get a little bit more clarity on why it's so much. I mean, we would all like to save $5 million, to pay off our houses every year, and, so we only have to worry about taxes, but if you're raising kids, it's really not realistic. So I'm just trying to, get some more clarity in that area. Why it's this 8 million annually proposed budget for only 11%, which is 875K, which is being paid out to staff.
Okay, so it's not budgeted at $8 million. That's our balance
Okay,
in the ERS reserve
at the end of the year.
at the end of last year,
Okay,
as of 6/30/21. That's our balance. Our expenses are in the $800,000 range. They go up typically every year. So we budgeted $875,000. For the expense, we budgeted the use of the reserves of $875,000.
okay, so do you have the number on how much we went up? Because you said the allotment is 8 million currently.
The
as of
balance
end
is
of the
$8
year,
million.
Which is the allotment, right? The allotment is how much it's gonna be, like, is.
No.
No, it's the balance.
It's a
It's
savings account.
The allotment is what comes out,
No.
875, right? Of the 8 million,
875 comes out.
Of the 8 million,
Yes.
correct. So how much is getting added to that 8 million for the year?
Bring the slide up.
Yeah, it might be able to.
Yeah, if
I don't think it was
So-
on there though.
Yeah, we're not adding to that account. We're taking money out of the account to pay for the expenditures for the year. We're not adding anything to the account.
Okay, so the
So-
ERS is staying the same? We're not adding.
We're
any
not
from
adding
the
money
budget?
to it. We're not budgeting to add money to it. We're budgeting to take money out of it to pay
Okay.
for the expenses for the employee retirement.
Okay,
Does that make more sense now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. One second. I have a couple in line, but I will get to you all.
Oh, there you go.
So you see, so that's the balance on the savings account, the first one. And then that's the expenses in the middle. I don't mean to point at you. I apologize. And then the one on the end is how much we're taking out of the savings account to pay for those expenses. That's just
Okay.
the easiest way to make it.
so then that's staying the same for the proposed budget for the year?
Right, nothing is changing. We're not adding money to it.
Okay, so as we take that out,
That
Are
number
we
on the left will go down.
correct?
Yes,
And how often do we reevaluate that?
every year, but we can only take out what our expenses are. We're not allowed to take out more than what the expenses are for the
No,
year.
I know.
Yeah.
And the auditors come every year. And there's an audit committee, which there are public community members on that audit committee as well. Us Review all this every single week.
And then,
I just
And-
thought that the
and-
8 million, like I said, it's good to have that balance, but I feel like based on what we're spending annually, like, okay, you would figure we're like a little bit over 8 years ahead.
But we can't spend it down unless the expenses are there. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we can't, we're not necessarily adding to it, but we can't spend down any more than what the expenses are
Okay.
every year.
Which makes sense. Okay.
Do you remember Alan, you gentleman comes like every October-ish in the fall? Comes here and he does a presentation about the audit. Well, anyway, he's all ordered and he goes through the whole process with us every year. He would ask that question.
Okay.
It gets reviewed.
And then they do come here and do a public presentation. And I know that.
This
you
is
have
the last
more.
question,
Okay,
last
go
question,
ahead.
last question.
Just
The
because I have
other
other
one,
people
I'm sorry to be.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
The last question is, we talked about extracurricular activities and educational programs that might be possibly stripped from the kids. Can anyone, whether it be from the board, Mr. Press, Ms. Riley, or Ms. Freeman, give us a little bit of perspective on what portion of the budget goes to extracurricular and educational programs? What portion of the allotted budget that we're voting on?
Like a percentage?
Yeah, I think there was a little breakdown in the educator, but percentage wise, so out of the entire budget, what portion goes to educational programs and extracurricular activities?
You mean academics and extracurricular
Correct,
combined?
yes,
I don't know. I can get it by next week.
okay. Is it much lower than 25%, much lower than 10%?
No, it's much higher.
No.
Much higher than that.
Okay,
The bulk, and I unfortunately, I don't have it with me, but we do present the budget in 3 parts back in May, and we break it down into administrative component, program, and capital. And the program component is the largest part of that. I don't recall the number off the top of my head, but it's.
okay, yeah, because when I looked at it in the educator, it looked a little bit different. And when you look at it on the line item budget, it presents a little bit different.
It depends on what you consider instructional program. You know, I mean, salaries of staff members are part of the instructional program. It's not just textbooks and,
Program component equals 78, I'm going to round it up. It's 80%, like 79% is program. Capital component is 12, administrative component is 9%.
78 program. And what was the other?
12 and 9.
Capital is 12 and administrative is 9.
Okay. Thank you.
Fellow won't sign my Just kidding, just
Just
kidding.
before we get to
Thank you.
other questions, someone asked about class size
I-
at secondary level. This is really the high school, I try to do different grade levels. Global 9 averaged about 23 students. Chemistry, which is typically 11th grade, 20 students. English 10, self-explanatory, 22 students. Geometry, I picked that one because it could be 9, 10, 10s, depending on the students, is 23.
Thank you. Okay, we had, Ms. Mumman, you had your hand up. I do see you guys out in the virtual audience. I'm gonna kind of flip back and forth.
Thank you. So just with regard to the transportation, you mentioned centralized pickup. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the contract, how centralized pickup could save money related to how the contract is structured, and maybe possibly how much could it save if we have to go to centralized pickup?
We would save money through centralized pickup, largely through the consolidation of vehicles. So as I mentioned, in one case, we send 4 small vans to one particular school. We could send 2 large buses. A van could cost us between $7,000 and $8,000 a month. So if we have 4 of those, we're talking about $28,000 a month. If we go to 2 large vehicles, the 2 large buses, they could cost us $9,000, $9,500 a month. So you get 2 of those, you pay $19,000 a month instead of $28,000. These are rough numbers.
So the structure is per vehicle, not necessarily per mile?
No.
Component of both?
No. The ways that we contract with buses, either if we have enough students, we pay for the entire vehicle. Or if we don't have enough students, if we're sending, for example, 2 students to one particular school, we essentially pay per seat. We pay a per student rate. So, and that rate could be $1,000, it could be $5,000 per student per month on a vehicle. If we do go to, a centralized pickup, it could be possible for us to combine routes for different schools, because the routes would potentially be shorter. When we have the buses coming through the neighborhoods, it takes time for them to do that. If we had centralized pickup, they pick up students and they hit the road, the route is shorter, so we could potentially combine more students and more schools on one route.
So essentially it's less vehicles. It would be like, that's what it comes down to.
That's the savings. It's not, we don't pay anything based on mileage or anything like that, yeah.
Has the district had to do this ever in the past to kind of have an understanding of what percentage-wise of the budget it might be able to save?
Back in 2011, there was a conversation that was not the year of the 9% budget increase, but back in 2011, there was conversation of centralized busing. It was a big conversation of centralized busing, but we've never actually had to go to centralized busing because it didn't become an issue at that time.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Sure, yeah, you're welcome.
Mr. Marcus, your hand was up first in the virtual audience, so if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
There we go. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. We were speaking before about the $8 million in the retirement funds. Those, and how we're not adding to that, aren't those funds from the retirees' contributions from their paychecks? The source of that $8 million, is that appropriated tax funds, or are those the retirees' contributions into the system?
So the $8 million, that's not appropriated tax funds, and it's not the employees' contributions. The employee contribution to their retirement, in some cases, employees do not contribute to their retirement tiers. They no longer contribute. Those in the later tiers, the employees do contribute, but they don't contribute the full amount. The district is required to contribute a certain percentage of employee salaries to each the ERS and the TRS reserve retirement systems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Mr. Pfeiffer, actually, you were up next if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you very much. It was a very clear presentation. I just noticed that one of the reserve funds you said was established a few years ago, and that you wanted to bring the fund balance up. Are there a target?
The target number.
I'm sorry, you cut off, Mr. Pfeiffer.
For target number.
That's what
Okay. The TRS reserve is interesting because it has its own built-in restrictions by law. So by law, we are only allowed to contribute annually 2% of the teachers or members, the salaries of members of the TRS retirement system annually. And we can only hold funds in that reserve up to 10% of that amount. So in terms of a target, I suppose that would be our target. That's the target that that the law allows.
Yeah, I think that, so if he comes back, we'll see if he has an additional question. Sir, you have a question? If you could identify yourself and then.
David Zerndorfer. Thank you for the presentation, very clear, very informative. Just to go back to the hot topic of transportation for a second. When you created the original budget, I guess back end of March, beginning of April, that transportation increase, the amount we're budgeting for, it hasn't changed, assuming since then, right? And you're in the budget.
Right, we have not changed the transportation.
And I imagine costs have grown astronomically also since then. So is there a concern that maybe that's not even enough right now?
No, it's a very good question. So there's two ways that we contract with the bus companies. We can either renew our contracts with them. So we have contracts with almost every bus company that operates in Nassau County. We have contracts with them. We can renew those contracts, or either we or the bus company can choose not to renew those contracts. if the contract is not renewed, we go out for a public bid. That's the case that would concern me the most, because you're going out on the open market and, you know, the price of diesel has skyrocketed. All of our bus companies have offered to renew just about all of our bus contracts. When we renew contracts, again, the law puts a limit on the increase in that contract rate. So the bus companies say, we want to renew. The renewal price is based on the rate of inflation. So, and again, all of our bus companies have said they want to renew. That rate these days is looking in the 5 to 6% range. It's a different measurement of CPI than you'll see in the paper. It's a more regional CPI. It's also different than the CPI we use for our school district tax levy. And so that's looking in that 5 to 6% range. I budgeted for a 6% increase in the transportation costs, so we should be covered. The real challenge for us is the new routes. When things pop up that we can't anticipate, people move into the district, they're going to a school that we don't send kids to currently. We have to bid those out. Sometimes that gets expensive. That concerns me more than the other expenses. Our big contract with our We Transport that does our in-district and some of the out-of-district transportation, we have a multi-year contract with them, so that rate is already set.
But you just mentioned before about the additional contracts. I mean, what percentage is that? How frequently does that happen? Is it significant? Because I imagine it's pretty much the same routes every year. I mean, how many new routes do you usually get that you have to worry about new contracts for?
It really depends. We don't get a lot, right? The number of schools that we have transported students to hasn't really changed the total number of schools. And the number of students we transport out of district has increased, you know, but at a much lower rate than the costs have increased. We got some requests that came in after the deadline this year for 2 schools that we don't send any students to. And so that becomes more of a challenge. Part of the challenge is we transport to so many schools and a lot of them start around the same time. So, you know, like here in the district, we have staggered start times for our different schools. So we can send kids to pick up the high school and then take that bus, go pick up Cornwell. It's hard to do that, particularly out of district, but especially when they start around the same time, because you got to make sure everyone gets to school on time.
I just want to point out 2 things. Just to give you another example, recently we figured a way to work it out. We did have a student come into the district, obviously nameless, but they were supposed to get bused from here to South Huntington on a daily basis. That was in May, April, May. So I mean, that's just an unexpected cost that could happen at any time. Does it happen all the time? I don't want to not exaggerate, but it does happen, right? And the other piece that you brought up, but budgeting process in every school district begins in November of the year. A little bit of this in the beginning is throwing darts. I mean, we budget conservatively. And I know, listen, see the number 17 million, I get it. I live in a district that's 2.5 times the size of this district, but demographically it's similar. The number's 2.5 times bigger. You see numbers, you're like, a lot of zeros, right? So I can appreciate that, and I do. But we do budget conservatively, but the process does start in November. We don't know what the tax levy is going to be. We don't know, you know, and then the administrator's like, well, what do we want to do this with? Okay, but always remember X, Y, and Z can happen. So the bus companies too, before Joel got here and I wasn't superintendent, I was still in the district though, we had some very favorable rates within about a decade or so ago. And now the bus companies are going out of business and they're merging and other things are happening. That's been a big problem too. And Mr. Press and I, one of our things we want to do this summer is meet with some of our local legislators because I don't know if I don't want to use the word collusion, but I'm just going to say it's very interesting to us that when we put out bids with there's only one bus company for that particular route. And that's happened on more than one occasion. So, you know, competitive bidding would help too. Not great, but it would still help some. So those are all things we want to look at and ways to try to drive down the cost.
And also just because people may have not heard the conversation before, we talked about it in the original budget. In the past, we looked into having our own buses in terms of options, and it wasn't really cost feasible. With the dramatic increase, if I heard you correctly last time, it is worth looking into again to find creative solutions to this problem moving forward, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is something that we're going to just at least try to run the numbers on it at this point, because the costs have increased so tremendously that it's certainly worth another look.
Thank you. Mr. Glass, you had a question?
Yes, first of all, I wanted to compliment Mr. Press, excellent presentation. I personally learned a lot. I wish there were many more people on listening to what you have to say today. Anyway, question, something I'm a little not clear about. I mean, you went through the presentation on the reserves because that was something that people were talking about before the election. The other thing that people were talking about, and I'm not sure it's the same or not, so I hope you could clarify for me, that was the issue of surpluses. So when we do the budget every year, we include in the budget the maintenance of those reserves, you know, to bulk them up to 4% or whatever targets that we have to do, or there's nothing in the budget on the having anything to do with an increase to a reserve.
We do not budget for the increase in reserves. If there is funding remaining at the end of the year, then we use that funding to either appropriate fund balance for the upcoming year, as we've been doing the last couple of years, or we use it to replenish the reserve funds.
So it's not part of
we don't budget to increase the reserves.
Okay, so you anticipated that question. Good.
Wait, so can I clarify something? So, like, for example, the budget that you're proposing right now originally was 2.14%. You explained the various factors that led it to 1.64%. In theory, if the 2.14 had passed, it technically would have been higher than the actual expenditures, because the actual expenditures would have been 1.64%. That wasn't anticipated. We didn't know the people were going to retire. We didn't know the replacements were going to be cheaper. So it wasn't like anything nefarious. It's you budgeted starting in November, and this is the number that came out, and that's how that would have worked. Am I understanding that correctly?
I mean, that's essentially it. We budget the levy to cover the expenses. We also look at use of the fund balance. So you've seen actually from 21-22 to 22-23, we've increased the use of fund balance because some of the expenses, you know, have gone up in certain areas. And so we felt it was appropriate that we could do that. So yeah, I think that's a accurate statement.
And in that regard, just to respond to what you were saying, you know, we could go out now with 1.64 tax levy. We think we're budgeting fiscally responsibly. We think that we're going to have enough money, and in the end, costs could rise or something else could happen. Excuse me, and we won't have enough money, and then we would have to take it out of the general. Correct.
Correct. And just to point out, and then I'm sure you had another part of your question. So the 2.14% was our proposed tax levy. It was also our tax cap. With the use of the debt service fund, the actual cap went down to 2.04, but we're proposing a 1.64% levy, so it's below the tax cap.
Mr. Blanche, you want to finish?
Okay, yeah. So I think I heard that if we go to the, if it doesn't pass now, we go to a budget which is $950,000 less than I think the original budget that failed. Is that correct? Is that the delta we're talking about?
No, the delta would be between this now newly proposed budget.
Okay.
Because it would go to a 0%.
Okay, and I didn't hear what the delta was between the budget that failed and the newly budget.
That one was, I think it was closer to 1.1 million.
The 1.1 million less, and that is different than the austerity budget or the contingency budget. 1.1 million. It's going to be even more. It's going to be about $2 million less than.
No. So the originally proposed tax levy increase was about 1.1 million.
Oh, tax levy. Okay.
Right. So that was the May vote. The June vote, what we're proposing is 1.64%.
Okay.
So that would be the difference there. So the 2.14 was about $1.1 million of the tax levy increase. Okay. So if you're looking at the delta between that one and the contingency, that's the change here. But we're proposing a lower budget here. So we've already cut about $190,000. We would have to cut another $950,000.
Right. Okay. And I guess the last question was, if we go to the contingency, by meaning if in fact it fails, the second budget, and we've laid out a bunch of potential doomsday scenarios, Doesn't mean that they're all gonna happen anyway, just some of them maybe. But one of the ones that we talked about was the targets, the size of the classroom, teacher-student ratios. Are teacher-student ratios really where they are because we targeted those ratios for academic excellence? Or wouldn't our preference be that we had more students in the schools and therefore, as a result, probably your class sizes will get bigger anyway? I mean, is it a bad thing for the class, or I mean, do we have some room there, or?
I wouldn't say no to a student coming to our school district. That's
Right.
what you're asking.
Right.
But it depends on the grade level too, right?
Yeah.
And you're not going to see 30 kids in an you're not going to see 30 kids in an elementary class. That's not reasonable, right?
Right.
Could you put 30, 31, 32 in an AP class? Well, yeah, because the expectations are such, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that, the chemistry class and the other.
So we're always looking to increase those numbers. But I mean, for a district our size, stay at the secondary level, we offer probably the most amount of AP type of courses that we possibly can. At some point you have to put together a master schedule with all these singleton classes, right? And make everything balanced, right? So theory in a math, we're not getting too crazy about it. With a master schedule, you almost have to start with like science classes because they have a lab, right? Then you have to look at special ed, and you also have to look at the singleton. All those things have to kind of happen at one time, and then you fill in everything else as you go. So it's a juggling act, and we obviously our management system helps with that, but we do a lot of it manually too to make sure it makes sense. So to answer your question, of course we always want more kids, but there's a point of I don't want 32 in an algebra class, but I'll put 30 in an algebra 2 class. Right. So it just depends on the class, honestly. I mean, it has to be.
So you
most sense
that.
for the kids
You had
and
to
the
cut back.
teacher.
Yeah, you had to cut back on teachers or coverages. You balance it out between those classes that could accommodate, or depending on the skills, the skill set of the teacher, of course. Yeah. Okay. But
No, it's a long conversation, but listen, $1 million, if we did nothing else and we just looked at staff, and I'm certainly not picking on teachers by any stretch,
yeah,
we love the work that they're doing here. That's 10, using round numbers, $100,000, 10 teachers. 10 teachers in a district this size, it's devastating. It's devastating. It really is. And I am not trying to, I was the principal of the high school when I got handed 10 envelopes and said, here, let them know they're not coming back. That's a tough call. That's so, again, it's just something to be part of the bigger discussion. Right?
Thank you.
And just to clarify, when you say, wouldn't we want more kids to be coming to the public schools? Of course, we want more kids to be coming to the public schools, but that also could mean the need for additional teachers to not make those class sizes so big, because we don't want those classes to be uncontrollable and or defeat the purpose of a class, because we want them to be able to hold a class where those students can learn. If you have, 35, 40 kids in a classroom, that's unacceptable. That's just not learning going on. I mean, it's very hard to be able to deal with all of that.
Yeah, well, years ago when you had more students, you managed with a budget that was probably significantly less than we have now. Yeah. So
we also had.
And our standards were a lot different years ago.
I wouldn't know.
So, all right. So thank you for that. Mr. Zelig, I see your hand up in the audience if you want to unmute yourself. I don't see him even trying. Mr. Zelig, are you there? Okay, so I'm going to go on to Mr. Azos. I see you I think I said that right. I'm sorry. If I didn't, I see you in the audience with your hand up if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, hi, thank you. And thank you for a great presentation. Just had a quick question with regard to, someone asked a little bit earlier about the estimated savings of having centralized pickup and drop-off locations for busing. I'm just interested in finding out what the estimated savings would be for restricting, facilities and other things from public use.
That would be hard to determine right now, I think.
Yeah, I don't have those exact numbers right now. It's a process, again, we would have to look at, in terms of transportation, all of our transportation, and so that's, we have in district, we have out of district, 220 schools. It's not even just 120 schools, it's, some of those schools have multiple routes. So it's a very, very complicated process that we would have to go through. So I don't, at this point in time, have those calculations. I hope not to have to do them.
I think his
Okay,
question.
yeah, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't asking about transportation, I was asking about restricting the use of facilities and fields from public use.
Right, I don't have that information either. It really would come down to, it's largely a question of overtime for generally the weekends, but I don't have those, I don't have the numbers. That's a requirement of state law, that outside groups could not use the facilities unless they paid for them themselves. So we haven't done any kind of estimate of what that cost savings might be.
Even if the savings.
Okay, does that, sorry,
matter.
just to follow up, does that law kick in only when there's a contingency budget, or is it in effect even, if the budget is passed?
That requirement only kicks in if we go to a contingency budget.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I see, I can't read this, it's so tiny. Mary Weinberg, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, I see, that, I don't know if you're on or not on, so the next person on here, it just says Mike Guest, so if Mike Guest wants to unmute and ask their question.
You guys hear me now?
Yes, wait, I got two of you on there now, so Ms. Weinberg, if you want to go first, and Mike will come back to you.
Sure. I'd like to hear what the board is doing in regards to security measures, in regards to recent events around the country. I mean,
ma'am, I hate to not, to say that we're not responding to that question right now, but that question would be for a regular, general board meeting. We do have security guards in every building, every day and patrolling, in the areas. I will give that answer, but unfortunately, that is not the meeting that we're in. I want to apologize for that. I do understand that everybody is concerned about, what's been happening, around the country. Mike, if you'd like to answer, unmute and ask your question. Mrs. Day, I'll come back.
Hi, yes. So a couple questions. First, so the 3 million that we said was unrestricted, is there any plan to use that for next year? And do we know how much we would use for next year in that 3 million unrestricted?
Are you asking how much we're using for actual items, or are you asking how much we're going to use in the budget for the following year?
In the budget for, well, no, I mean, are we planning on dipping into that 3 million for next year? Is there some type of estimate on what we're going to use that 3 million for?
So the 3 million, with the exception of the 250,000 that we mentioned earlier for the repair, the structural repair at Chestnut Street, that $3 million is not, it's not budgeted for use. It's there in case we need it.
And sorry, if that's the case, so we wouldn't need to, restrict what students can use. Is there a reason why we wouldn't try to use from that 3 million to make up for the budget in case it fails? Like, why can't we just use? Why, if the issue is the tax levy, which is my assumption, then why wouldn't we try to dip more into that for our actual budget, so that we can not restrict student programming?
Because the purpose of those funds is to be there in case of emergency. If we tap into them, then those funds are no longer available to us. And there is the possibility that if there is some emergency that occurs, we would not have funding to address that emergency.
Is there some type of average on what we use every year from that fund?
We don't. It's
We never
there,
use that.
just the
We haven't
emergency.
used that yet.
We used it 2 years ago for the COVID budget.
Right.
Well, we held the fund balance there. We did not have the need. The governor had threatened to withhold state aid. He did not. And some of our expenses actually came in lower because we weren't running things like athletics, or as we weren't running full athletic seasons. There weren't field trips. There were a lot of expenses that we did not incur. But we don't budget.
So sorry. So let's say in the last 5 years, we haven't dipped into that at all. That 3 million.
Well, it hasn't been 3 million necessarily, but again, we don't budget for the use of that, and we have not, in that period of time, we have not had the need to dip into it.
Okay. And my second question was about the 8 million ERS. I thought I heard, and maybe I misunderstood, was that we're not budgeting anything for ERS. We're going to just take out 875,000 from the reserves. But is that accurate? Because I thought that we were budgeting 875,000 for the ERS.
We are budgeting 800. We're budgeting $875,000 in expenses in the budget for next year, and we are budgeting the use of $875,000 of the reserves to cover those expenses.
So your prediction would be that at the end of next year, our reserve for ERS would still be about 8 million.
That's not my prediction at all. It's entirely possible, but it's likely that if we use the reserves and we are not able to replenish them, then that balance will decrease.
Let me just, sir, I'm just going to try to explain it a little the way that I explained it earlier. So we're taking that $8 million is, say, the savings account for the ERS. We're taking $875,000 out of that savings account to pay for the $875,000 worth of expenses.
No,
So
I
it's like-
understand. I understand that,
We're
but
not putting money back into it unless there's overage at the end of the year. We don't budget to put money back in. It's what goes into the reserves at the end of the year is any kind of overage. I'm like talking to the man's name. I don't know why I'm looking at
Mike, or maybe I misunderstood then. I thought he just said that we are budgeting 875,000.
So the expected expenses for that, for the ERS is $875,000. We are budgeting to remove $875,000 from those reserves.
Yes, so what you're budgeting would be a reserve of the same exact amount at the end of the year.
No,
because we're adding 875 and then removing 875.
Sir, we're removing it from the $8 million. So it would be $875,000 less than $8 million.
So then what you're saying is that at the end of the year, it would be about 7.1 million is what you're.
Correct. Let's say yes.
But that's not.
Wait.
Yeah.
That's not what, so in the budget, in the budget of 71 million, there is a line item for 875,000.
Right, because those are the expenses. We have to budget to put
No,
that.
agreed, but I assume that there's money going into that if we're budgeting.
Okay, I need to, okay, let me try to do this again. The money going into that is the 875 coming out of reserves. It's not going into the reserves, it's coming out of the reserves. And then the expenditure is the $875,000. So it's like a wash. They're washing.
No, I understand that, but why would that be in, maybe what I'm misunderstanding then?
Has to be listed in there, correct, Joel? The money, the 875 has to be in there as a line item. To take the money out, it comes in as a revenue, and then we're spending it.
Right, and so there's not one single line item that is $875,000. The contributions come from different budget codes. So there are multiple codes that go to make up the $875,000 of expense. But there are line items in the budget that add up to $875,000 of expenses.
So we're not adding to the reserve.
Correct.
Now, the slide that I presented was for us to use to take money out, as Ms. Brome said, take money out of the reserve to cover the expense.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Zelik, I'm just gonna give you one more chance, maybe if you can unmute now. Okay, I see.
Yeah,
you.
sorry, I must have had an issue with my audio. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question, a couple quick questions. On the 8 million, it seems it's been discussed, so sorry if I missed it. My understanding is many districts don't have it. Manhasset, which has like 3,000 students, has 0 in ERS reserves. Do you know where we rank in terms of the percentage over the tax levy in total in ERS reserves?
I think those are two different concepts, the percent over the tax levy and ERS reserves.
In terms of how we rank versus other districts in the amount we have in ERS reserves versus other districts. Can you speak to that, or do you have any
No, I
numbers
don't
related to
have
that? No,
I don't have that information.
Okay. And then where are the numbers from this current year in terms of, I know we're almost at the end of the budget season, right? June 30th is the audit. So how are we in terms of our spending this year or overall numbers? Do you know where the numbers are in terms of spending versus what the budget was this past year for the current year?
I don't have that available to me at the moment.
We can get those answers.
Okay. Okay. I think it would just be helpful for context. And then what's the projected enrollment for the upcoming year? I know we discussed doing like a new enrollment study. I think it was mentioned in January and was mentioned being considered. I guess, can you just talk to what the projected enrollment would be? And has there been any progress in doing a new enrollment study?
So currently, our projected enrollment is approximately the same as it is right now. We're not seeing a large decline in enrollment. We're waiting on the final numbers for the kindergarten center. And then, of course, we have the pre-K center that has additional students in it now. And then as far as an enrollment study, that's something that we're considering, yeah.
Okay, considering, okay. And then I guess the size of the 12th grade class that's leaving this year, how many students are in that versus, let's say, kindergarten?
Kindergarten, this year's like 116, and the high school has how many seniors this year?
120 today.
Joe, Michelle?
150 leaving.
150 seniors. There's 110 or 112 kids in kindergarten. That's your question.
Okay, so 110 versus 150, right? Sorry if I missed it.
Right, but that unfortunately doesn't follow through. There could be 120 kids in kindergarten today and 130 first graders next year. It's all about who comes in and who goes out.
Sure, that's possible.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. Oh, I'm
Okay, I
sorry.
had a couple of questions about the income for the district, where our money comes from and how we work with it. I know some of it has to come from the state, some of it comes from taxes. I don't know if there's additional money that comes in from grants or other special funding. Also, what about interest on this monstrous reserve we're sitting on? I understand it's all dedicated, but for example, the 8 million sitting in the ERS fund, I assume that's in an interest-bearing account. Okay, within whatever requirements the law may have over what you can invest in. But where does that interest go? Is it locked into the ERS account? Does it go to the general fund?
The interest on the reserve, it's a good question. The interest on the reserves stays in the reserves.
Okay, so it can't come over into general.
It doesn't, no, it stays in the reserves. And the interest rates, I guess I would say recently, but up until recently have been peanuts.
Yes.
So we are looking into ways within the restrictions of the law to invest those reserve funds. Outside of, right now, they are in interest-bearing accounts, but the interest has not been significant.
And the significant, for example, if you budgeted 100,000 for snow removal and there was no snow, what happens with that 100,000? Where does it wind up? Or is that something the board has to decide at the end of the year what they're going to do with it? Does it automatically go into next year's budget?
So each year's budget is distinct, with the exception I mentioned some of the purchase orders that carry forward. if we budgeted $100,000 for snow removal and we had no snow removal, that's an expense we did not incur. At the end of the year, we look at the expenses that we incurred, we look at the revenue. If the revenue exceeds the expenditures, we have a surplus. That is where we either decide to fund the reserves with the surplus, or we could appropriate for the appropriate fund balance to fund the next year's budget.
Mr. Lazar, you had a question?
Can I, I've been waiting.
I've been waiting.
He hasn't-
You got to go. I have to go to everybody first. Mr. Lazar, go
Thank you,
ahead.
thank you. A great presentation. Thank you, everybody, for all your hard work. So some of the questions I heard people asking at other times and over here is like with the reserves. So you have the $8 million reserve that $875,000 is going to come out of it. And then we're talking about when there's additional money from the prior year to possibly use that to replenish some of these reserves. I think that's a big question that everyone really has on their minds, is why do we need to, and that's what we should say, why do we need to replenish those reserves? And if we do, why do we need to do it this year when people are saying we're going into recession and people are having a hard time? That's, I think, the big question, because that 875,000, because everyone's done a great job for the past bunch of years. I think it's 4% that we've been over budgeting, which is great, which means that we did a great job. But this year's 4%, can't some of that be used instead of being put in these reserves, like the reserve fund that has $3.5 million in it was 1.3 million in 2019. Why does it have to be 3.5 now? Is the questions that people have, and that would be great answers for everyone to understand. So you can let us know.
I don't even have to ask my question.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. When at the end of the year, if we do have again revenue over expenditures, we don't know that until the end of the year. When we develop the budget, we start developing the budget, as Mr. Reman said, in the fall, October, November. We don't know what we're going to end the year with at that point. So we don't know. We can't budget for the revenue over expenditures. We don't know what that's going to be. We do, as I said, we've appropriated fund balance. That's essentially what we're doing, appropriating the $2.4 million from that fund balance to leave us with around that 4%, sort of the rainy day fund. At the end of the year, when we have revenue over expenditures, it has to go, something has to happen. It either goes into reserves, we could appropriate it for the next year, but again, we've already developed the budget, and the budget's been adopted in May before we end the year. The only place other than the reserves and to appropriate it would be for it to sit in the unassigned fund balance, that 4% rainy day fund, which the comptroller frowns upon. Right? There's a law that says 4%. If you start accumulating that up to higher levels, you're going to draw the attention of the comptroller. So those funds have to go somewhere. Either you hold them in unassigned fund balance, you put them into reserves, you appropriate them for use in the next year's budget.
All right, so I have a suggestion, a solution. Why don't we have a vote for creating a fund that is to be used towards the teaching, all of that's 78% of the entire budget. And this way, the previous year's extra money goes into that fund, which can then be used for.
Can't do it. Yeah.
Why not?
Because the law specifies the types of reserves that we can establish and the types of expense that the funds in those reserves can be used for. There's no reserve that the law allows us to create for that purpose. What we could, there are things like the capital reserve, which we talked about earlier. If we had funds, excess funds at the end of the year surplus, put them into the capital reserve. There's plenty of capital projects that need to be done throughout the district. That would be one way for us to use those reserves in terms of sort of operations of the district. We can't just create a fund for the instructional program. The law doesn't allow us to do that.
So, but that's I think where the biggest concern of everyone in the community is this 4%, which is great that we have that extra every year, but we need to find a more creative way of being able to allow it to be utilized properly. And maybe, yes, putting into the capital fund, which you're going to have capital expenses the next year and using it towards that. But that's, I think, what a lot of people are asking for.
no one wants to change the education of our community. It's our children and our neighbors' children, and we're all neighbors. But people don't want to spend money that they wouldn't spend if they were taking it out of their own pocket. So they want to understand how this is done properly. So I think we need to think about that a little bit. It probably can't happen for this year's budget anyways, but we might want to think about that for the future. The other question I've heard a lot of people asking about is, at one point we had Highland Park in our schools, and we had more students in our schools. We all know the community's been changing somewhat, and there's more people in private schools, so that's been going down. Maybe it makes sense to discuss a little bit of how those changes have affected the amount of classrooms that are available. Like you just said, that you had to use space from your office to make another office because there's no space there. So people want to understand this. So if you can just explain, or maybe someone else on the board, because you're maybe that's not your position, where these classrooms and what's been happening with this change, how it's affecting things. Because that's another thing that people are saying, you're hiding something. Whether it's true or not, people are thinking it. And so that's what we want to make sure to bring public, is that it's not being hidden. Look, this is exactly what's happening. This is what we're doing.
I do just want to jump back 1 second to the 4% part that you keep saying that we're budgeting to add 4%.
Not that you're budgeting for.
We're not planning to have 4%. That's our legal limit, and that's really a safety net. I don't know if you had heard me earlier talk about the fact that in the years past, prior administrations and prior boards had allowed that 4% to go down to so low that that following year they had to go out of a 9% budget. We're never passing a 9% budget. That's why 2 years ago, we as a district made the decision to go out at a 0, because at that time we felt it was the most pertinent thing to do. It was the best thing for the community because of because of COVID and everything, and people weren't working. We understood that. But we also can't spend down that money, because then we'll have nothing. God forbid something happens, there'll be nothing to do. Like I had used this example the day of the budget vote. I was having a conversation with somebody, and I said, when I was getting older and I had to be an adult, my parents told me that you should always have at least 2 months of your mortgage in the bank. We don't have 2 years of our operating expenses in the bank, but we have to have some sort of cushion to make sure that if something happens, we have the ability to pay for stuff. So that is where these things come from. And yes, we can spend down some of the ERS and spend down stuff like that and not replenish it. Like that might not be a fund we would put money in at the end of the year, because that one happens to be largely funded. But we also can't take money out of that unless it's specifically for ERS funding.
Correct.
So
On the same
I just
page
wanted
with
to make sure that people were, I see you, Mr. Day.
The 4% that I was mentioning was not in the discretionary issue budget. It was more of, you guys are doing a great job, that we happen to have a surplus each year.
Right, but we don't budget to have a surplus.
No, exactly. You're doing a good job.
Let's
You're
make
just
that very
spending
clear. We don't budget to have a surplus, and and there have been years where we've come within like $9,000 of our budget.
Right.
So it really is, we budget tightly, and during the COVID years, obviously, there was a surplus, which is why some of these things have grown, because we didn't have sports, and we didn't have to transport to activities, and we didn't have, things going on in the buildings, because obviously nobody was in buildings, that they were closed. So there was a surplus at that point. So I just wanted to speak to that. And then to go back to the classroom question, do you want to answer the question about what's being
how things changed
asked
since
about?
Well, the element, like we said before, elementary schools are pretty tight. Except that back in February or January, February, we did a presentation on why, some of the reasons why we're moving to a secondary school, now be 7-12 next year. One of them is declining enrollment, in particular, Highland Park students left. So in that presentation, we talked a little bit about saving money over the next, 3 to 5 years, and doing that through different strategies, looking at retirements and things like that, looking at class sizes as we and so again, we want to do that conservatively, because once we do it, we don't want to go back. Because the one thing I learned in my time here in this district a decade ago, when I was handed those 10 letters to access, by the end of the summer, they brought back 7. So you didn't really save you didn't save $1 million, right? So if we're going to do it this time, which makes sense in certain cases, right? But once you do it, you can't go back. So I want to make sure we're doing it right. So I'm going to give you one example. We know we have one clerical person who didn't come back. We're going to replace them with somebody else, but we're not replacing that position. So we're already down a position, right? So the next year, in the 22-23 school year at the secondary plant, we're going to be evaluating the entire system 7 to 12. And we'll see what works, what's not, and where there are efficiencies. And where there are efficiencies, we'll make those decisions. And we'll do that over the next 3 to 5 years. But again, the educational leader, I have to do two things at one time. I have to be conservative on the budgeting side, I have to be conservative on the academic side. So once I do this to help this, I don't want to go back. So I'd rather do it a little bit more slower fashion or more conservative fashion. People might like it, and I can understand that. But again, once we do it, we're not going to go back. The gentleman, he talked about grants as revenue. Sorry. We entered a partnership with Northwell Health with the growing mental health, and I'm only going to talk about West Hempstead, the growing mental health services that are in need for our students here and families. And that's part of the Northwell Health experience. It's for families as well. We felt that was important. You might have heard that this year we secured an $800,000 grant over a year for the next 5 years. So a logical question, anyone who's not intimately involved, why don't you just use that to pay them if you can, right? It's for parents, it's for students and families to support them academically. I want to run some, for example, for adults, some adult ed programs. We want to run more summer programs, right, that maybe we couldn't do for our students, and then run programs during the year. But we can't use that money to reduce the budget or pay down the budget or however you want to state that. So we do look at those things. And I know some people feel the top of the food chain here in the district office, it's maybe too much, but hate to tell everybody, but you're looking at the people who wrote that grant. We're not looking for the credit. We don't, talk about Manhasset. Manhasset has a grant writer. Great Neck has a grant writer. We write the grant, which is fine. We're not complaining. We love to do it because there's a chance to work together. So there are unintended consequences of everything. And so once we make a decision, I can't go back this time because it's not fair to everybody else. Having lived through that once, and then I'm going to stop to look at people 10 times and then bring 7 of them back. The point is that you didn't help what you were trying to accomplish.
And I think that was what is important for people to hear, that there is a plan, there is thought about it, stuff like that, as opposed to, because the assumption is, I know better than you, you must not be doing something right. Is what,
and that's fair,
that's why I wanted it to be addressed.
And that's the beautiful thing about this community, right? It's diverse in many ways. And so people can come together and have good discussions. I'm happy that people are here tonight to have a discussion open and honestly and put to bed any misinformation that might be out there. But as long as we all work together and helping all the students, the West Hempstead Community Scholarship Fund dinner is this Thursday. That dinner is for all students in our community, which is a wonderful event. The $800,000 grant, in part, is for students and families in the entire West Hempstead community, not the district. And that's one of the reasons that grant attracted us, because we can help not just part of the community entire. Thank you for your question.
And I just want to make clear, because you mentioned the Island Park students, and I don't know that everyone listening is aware. The Island Park students only were the high school students. So we didn't take Island Park K-12 or middle school, it was just high school students. So those students stopped coming here, was just affecting at the high school.
Mr. Cole, you had a question?
Yes, well, comments more than questions, which won't surprise me to hear, but Joel, sir, great job. Great job by everyone and great questions. This is a discussion that needs to be had. And to borrow one of my favorite phrases, never let a good crisis go to waste. And if this budget being voted down has done anything, hopefully it's gotten the attention to those of us in the community to whom we need, of those who need to be paying attention. Because this is a very transparent process. I came into this community 18 years ago, got involved in the district, have been involved in budget things, walked in here thinking, oh, well, I know how, here's $500,000, there's a, and as I've been involved in this now over the years and had the privilege to serve on the board and been involved in budget workshops, listened to do the auditors look at this, I know how efficiently we run this district. I also know how much effort we as our larger community have put into this district to get the quality of the school and the education and the programs and the facilities to where we are today. And it is not, none of this popped out of a hat. A lot of people in this community, tremendous amounts of effort into what we are now seeing around us, and we walk around here and we see these kids and the programs and the non-school day, 9-hour day, class day, the pre-kindergarten, all of the different advanced placement programs, the college affiliations, our football and athletic facilities, our championship teams, everything that's going on around this district. And when I think about the notion that we could potentially vote this budget down again and go to a contingency budget, which would save each community and this community 2 pair of shoes or two tanks of gas at the expense of our children, our community, and by every measure, the largest measure of the quality of the community is the quality of our public schools. I've had kids go to private schools. I have kids in the public schools. The public schools are essential measure of our community. And yes, $70 million is a lot of money. I get it. I pay my taxes. I would love to see our taxes go down. It's not the world we live in. It's not realistic. Yes, we can try and do as efficiently as we possibly can. But I hope, Bert, I look forward to working with you, sir, next year. And as we get into this process, you will see how detailed it is, because every single dollar is accounted for. And nothing is done casually, flippantly, without a lot of process, a lot of thought, and gnashing of teeth at times. But I will tell you, if we take this thing apart, what we're taking apart, there are 2 areas, and I've talked about this every time I've run for school. 2 areas. You can cut programs or you can cut busing. That's where the money is, ladies and gentlemen. That's where the money is. So it will, when I think about Mr. Riemann, and he made that comment about having to fire 10 teachers, it would destroy this community. People would be in tears. Families, generations of families that have been in this community. This is what we're trying to work with. And yes, it's 2022. Yes, it's expensive. And Mrs. Brome is tired of listening to me. What's that? She yielded the floor? Did she have a choice?
She had a lot of water.
But this is critically important, and I welcome the community to be a part of this. I encourage all of us in this room and online to go out and talk to our friends and neighbors in this community, let them know how important this is. This is no laughing matter. We go to a contingency budget and there will be gnashing of teeth. It is not anything anybody wants to watch. It's like watching somebody take bankruptcy. If bankruptcy is good, if you're a bystander on the sideline, you don't want to be in it. You don't want your children and your family and your community to be a part of that. So I encourage us all to really pay attention to this budget. Mr. Press, thank you so much for your explanation and all your detail. There is much more detail, I can tell you from personal experience, not because I've looked at it, because this year I haven't. I will have to next year, though. But I can tell you every single dollar is accounted for. And those of you that are smarter than I am can look at that and add that up and ask all the questions and take a look at it. But I can assure you that this budget has been done with the highest level of integrity and effort and professionalism. And I encourage everyone to go out and encourage all of your friends and neighbors to vote for this budget. Thank you very much.
Since we're waiting to see if there's any last questions, and Mr. Cole broke out the pom-poms. And this has nothing to do with the budget, but I'm proud of what goes on in this community, so I just want to share these things. For the first time ever, our outdoor boys track and field won the Nassau County Class A championship, first in history, I'm told. This is all in the past week, just to keep this in the back of your head. High school band received gold, level 4 status at NISMA. And middle school band, which has never been in NISMA, secured silver in level 2. So those are all great things. And then the only other thing I want to point out, which it should be a proud moment for everybody in the community, we'll have more of that at Thursday's scholarship dinner. This year's seniors, this is with less than 50% reporting, have accepted over $4 million in scholarships. Not what schools they've been accepted to, and not what they off scholarship monies they've been offered, like other schools report. They inflate the numbers or they pad the numbers, right? This is actual monies. $4 million. It's less than 50% of 150 kids. That's pretty. That's not a bad day. It's not a bad week of work. We were just waiting for you to come back. I stole pom poms from Ole Miss and brought them down to Richmond. And, now we're back.
I will say one more comment, if I may, but any notion that there's something being hidden, please encourage your friends and neighbors to look, to listen to this presentation, to look at this. It's only because if you think something's being hidden, it's only because you've chosen not to dig into it. Because believe me, the detail is there. There's nothing hidden. Thank you.
And one last point, if you go to the website, top right corner, I can't make it any easier. That's all I'm going to say. Top right corner of the website, when you log on, black bar, it says budget. You click on that, it brings you right to the page. Not even 2 clicks anymore, 1 click. 1 click away from the Joe Press promised land.
No, I just wanted to say, just to follow up on what Mr. Cole was saying, if there are questions, feel free, people can reach out to me.
Central office.
Or central office. We're happy to answer any questions that people may have. If something looks a little off, again, you see a number out there, 17.8 million. Call and if something looks a little off, it's not off, it just looks off. And we can explain that like we did tonight. So I encourage people, if they do have questions, to call.
Did somebody have a question up there?
I was curious, I'm not sure about this, but you said a $153 reduction in taxes if we went to a contingency budget?
That's that would be the average. So it wouldn't be a reduction, it would just be, that would be the increase. If the budget passed, the increase for the average single family homeowner would be $153. If the budget does not pass, then you sort of save the $153 by not having to pay it. It's not a reduction.
Right, okay, so it's, okay, I got it. 22 cents a day.
Yeah, 2 pairs of shoes. Or 2 pairs of shoes in Pat's house, apparently. I do just want to take a minute to thank you, Mr. Press, for your presentation. We will be representing this information again next week. And just a reminder to everybody that what was presented tonight was central office's recommendation to the board to go out with this 1.64. When we come back next week, we will have a conversation about it again to determine if that's what we're going out with, and then that budget would be adopted at next week's meeting. This, again, is the first time that we've as well heard the presentation. We do get that stuff sent home prior, but like just the day before to review it. And then we'll have to make a decision on that. Whatever we adopt next week is what's going to go before the voters on the 21st. And again, on the 14th, at our regular business meeting, and Ms. Weinberg, if you're still on, you could reach out to central office or myself, and we could talk more about your questions that was not necessarily budgetary related. But at our regular business meeting on the 14th, we will have our budget hearing, which means Mr. Press will go over this again. And then additionally, you could ask more questions if you have any additional questions that you come up with in the meantime. So
just please, if everybody, anybody, if you know anybody that has questions, have them come to next week's meeting. I mean, that's the only way they're gonna learn about the budget, is to ask questions. Tell everybody, tell anybody, ask the questions, because they ain't gonna learn unless they ask the question.
All right, so at that point, I'm just gonna ask one more time, does anybody else in the audience have a question in regard to that, or anybody? Yes, ma'am.
So the presentation that you gave this evening will not be available to the public until you go through it and it'll be available.
No, it'll be posted on the website.
It is posted.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll have it,
sure.
we'll have it posted tomorrow.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily the adopted budget. This is the recommendation from central office to the board, okay? But yes, this will be available on the website tomorrow. And again, as Mr. Magarachi stated, if anybody has questions, our numbers are on the back of the calendar. Central office is open every day. We're more than willing to answer questions. I am not going to answer questions via social media. I tend not to do that because I feel that it becomes a little bit of a disaster. So content, written word, context, it gets very confusing for people sometimes. I will happily have a phone conversation with somebody. I will happily meet somebody in person if I can do so. But again, I don't generally answer questions via social media. So if you want to ask me a question, email me, please call me, text me, whatever you want to do. And with that, I need a motion to adjourn.
So move second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for
Enjoy
coming
your
out
week.
tonight.
We'll see some of you every day this week at some events.
Check like midday.